Let's take a walk into the unknown together. Make sure you're subscribed, leave your comment, and hit like to help us continue the journey. Inside the abandoned hospital tunnels, I heard screams that weren't human. The memory isn't a picture, it's a sound. It hits me sometimes when I'm walking through the grocery store or stuck in traffic. A low, grating sound, like sheet metal dragged across concrete, followed by a raw, wet gasp. But the worst part, the part that wakes me up drowning in sweat, is the second layer, the thing underneath the noise, a scream that was wrong. Not the high-pitched, desperate cry of a human in pain, but something impossibly deep, resonating from a chest that must have been made of stone and cable. It wasn't just terror I heard, it was a noise that violated the natural order of things. It was the sound of something that should have remained buried. My name is Elias Vance, and I am the architect of my own subterranean nightmare. I've always had a problem with stillness. My life, frankly, was a monument to beige mediocrity, a small apartment, a corporate job crunching numbers for an energy firm, the kind of work that pays bills but never feeds the soul. I used to be a history major, fascinated by the remnants of the past, the places where human drama had played out and been forgotten. That fascination evolved into an obsession with urban exploration, or urbex, as the community calls it. While most people spend their weekends hiking mountains or watching movies, I spent mine trespassing into decay, abandoned factories, derelict schools, and most thrillingly, forgotten hospitals. I wasn't looking for ghosts. I was looking for proof that I was still alive, for something authentic that hadn't been filtered through a screen or a spreadsheet. The rush came not from the danger of collapsing floors, but from the silence, the oppressive weight of time that these places held. You could almost hear the echoes of the lives lived and lost there. But St. Jude's was different. St. Jude's Asylum and Medical Center wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed, or at least that's how the legend went. Built in 1928, it was a sprawling, Gothic revival complex, designed to be a self-contained city of healing. But its grand purpose quickly soured. Whispers of questionable experimental procedures, particularly in the deep subterranean wings, began almost immediately. By the late 1960s, a combination of budget cuts, a catastrophic fire that claimed the West Wing, and a devastating scandal involving patient disappearances forced its closure. It was boarded up, sealed, and left to rot, a giant, crumbling sentinel on the outskirts of the city, too massive and historically significant to be demolished, yet too toxic to be repurposed. The real allure, the thing that snagged my mind like a rusty hook, wasn't the asylum itself. I'd seen plenty of peeling paint and rusted surgical tables. It was the tunnels. Local folklore, mostly whispered on old, forgotten internet forums, claimed that St. Jude's was connected to the old city sewer system and a pre-existing network of limestone caves. The architects, supposedly, had incorporated a sophisticated network of utility and transport tunnels beneath the main complex. These tunnels, they said, were the true heart of the hospital's dark history, where experimental research continued, where patients were moved in secret, and where, allegedly, the facility's most profound and disturbing secrets were buried. Unlike the hospital above ground, which had been looted and partially explored over the decades, the entrances to the tunnels had been professionally sealed with concrete and rebar during the closure, suggesting a level of secrecy the administration was desperate to maintain. I spent 6 months researching St. Jude's, poring over old blueprints, fire marshal reports, and historical society archives. I found a single, faint line drawing in a 1935 engineering journal, showing a service tunnel intersecting with a deep sub-basement under the old laundry facility. That was my target. For this job, I needed a partner. Not just someone with a camera, but someone with guts and skepticism in equal measure. I chose Chloe. Chloe was a freelance photographer, 5 years younger than me, with a cascade of fiery red hair and eyes that missed nothing. She didn't believe in ghosts, which I appreciated. She believed in sharp angles, perfect lighting, and the art of the captured decay. She viewed St. Jude's as the ultimate portfolio piece. "Elias, you're sure this laundry room entrance hasn't been breached?" Chloe asked a week before the planned descent, leaning over my grainy printout of the blueprint in my cramped living room. Her voice was pure practicality, cutting through my anxious excitement. "Positive," I said, tracing the line with a worn fingertip. "The main maintenance hatch under the morgue has been torched and welded shut. Everyone hits that first. This one, in the original 1930s steam tunnels near the old coal chute? It's been bricked over, not cemented. A good rotary hammer and some careful work, and we're in. This is the only way into the deep network." Chloe raised an eyebrow, adjusting her glasses. "Deep network? You make it sound like the subterranean lair of a supervillain." "Fine. But if a 300-pound zombie nurse pops out, you're taking point." We planned the expedition meticulously, timing it for a new moon weekend to minimize light pollution and casual park patrols. Our gear was professional-grade, military-spec flashlights, respirators, first-aid kits, enough bottled water to last 12 hours, and a high-powered rotary hammer and battery packs, heavy, silent promises of access. The night we finally went, the air was thick and cold, the kind of late autumn chill that sinks right into your bones. The main hospital building was everything the legends promised: dark, vast, and silent. The main lobby was a moonlit cathedral of shattered glass and water-stained marble. We moved quickly, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust and damp plaster coating the floor. Finding the laundry facility was easy enough. The huge, rusting machinery looked like skeletal dinosaurs. The air here was heavier, smelling not just of mold and decay, but of something metallic and faintly chemical, like old blood mixed with industrial detergent. The tunnel entrance was exactly where the blueprint suggested, behind a bank of massive, century-old industrial dryers, hidden by a fallen concrete shelf. It was, as I'd hoped, a simple brick wall, a clumsy, hasty job from the 60s, not the rebar-reinforced concrete used on the high-traffic access points. It took us 2 hours of careful, patient work. The rotary hammer whined, the noise swallowed by the thick concrete walls, echoing dully in the vast space. We removed the bricks one by one, piling them silently on a tarp. When the opening was large enough for us to squeeze through, a gush of air hit us. It wasn't a draft. It was a single, heavy sigh of stale, cold air, rich with the smell of wet earth and copper. It wasn't the smell of decay from the hospital above. This was the smell of the underground. It was an air that hadn't moved in 50 years, and as it hit my face, a sudden, acute wave of dread washed over me. It felt less like entering a tunnel and more like breaking into a tomb's ventilation shaft. Chloe paused, her head tilted, listening to the darkness. "That's not right," she murmured, her skepticism momentarily cracking. "It's just stagnant air." I whispered back, trying to sound confident. But I felt it too. The silence here wasn't empty, it was full. I shined my powerful LED light into the darkness. The beam was swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive blackness, but for a moment, it illuminated a tight, low-ceilinged passage. The walls were lined with rough-hewn stone and occasional patches of slick, dark green moss. The ground was wet clay. Unlike the neat, tiled floors of the hospital above, this was raw, primitive architecture. This was the intersection of human engineering and the original, untouched earth beneath the city. I put on my respirator. The mask felt like a small, cold barrier against the unknown air. "I'm going first," I said. Chloe nodded, her flashlight already slung over her shoulder, camera ready. "Don't do anything stupid." I slid through the opening, landing softly on the cold, damp clay floor. The weight of the hospital settled above me, a crushing, silent presence. I stood, crouching slightly in the low tunnel. The beam of my flashlight jittered nervously as I swept it across the walls. Pipes, thick and corroded, ran along the ceiling, dripping steadily into shallow puddles. When Chloe slid through, sealing the breach with the heaviest concrete slab we could move, a necessary precaution against detection, the world outside vanished. The blackness was total, pure, and absolute. We began walking, following the gentle curve of the service tunnel downward. 5 minutes in, and the sound of the dripping water became the only constant. 10 minutes, and the temperature dropped sharply, not just to cold, but to an unnatural, bone-aching chill that no ventilation could explain. It was here, in that perfect, echoing, sub-zero darkness, that the first true anomaly presented itself. I stopped dead, holding up a hand to stop Chloe. "What is it?" she whispered. I shook my head, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My light beam was fixed on a dark, wet patch of wall. I knew the silence was oppressive, absolute, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water. But then, as I stood there, straining, the dripping stopped. And in that sudden, deafening quiet I heard it. It wasn't a scream, not yet. It was something far worse, the subtle, unmistakable sound of a heavy, slow exhalation that didn't belong to either of us. A rasp of breath drawn deep, somewhere close, just around the curve of the tunnel ahead. It sounded like something huge and awake. My blood turned to ice. My hand instinctively grabbed the hefty steel pipe wrench I'd brought for protection. Chloe's light snapped toward the sound. And then, the exhalation was followed by a scrape, a deliberate, heavy drag across the clay floor, like something being pulled toward us. We were a mile underground, sealed in, and we were not alone. The absolute, terrifying realization hit me. This place wasn't just abandoned. It was occupied. The absolute, terrifying realization hit me. This place wasn't just abandoned. It was occupied. For maybe 5 seconds we were statues carved from pure fear. My mind, usually a chaotic, overthinking battlefield, went utterly blank. All that existed was the cold, the darkness, and the rhythmic drag-scraped sound approaching us from the unseen bend in the tunnel. "Back!" I mouthed to Chloe, my voice swallowed by the thick cotton of the respirator mask. She didn't need prompting. She was already retreating silently, pulling her heavy camera bag tighter to her back. We moved backward with agonizing care, reversing our steps on the wet clay, aiming for the concealed entrance we had sealed moments ago. Every primal instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but that would mean noise, and noise in the subsurface vacuum felt like a death sentence. The scraping stopped. The sudden silence was far worse than the sound. It was the calculated silence of something listening. My flashlight beam, which I was trying to keep low to the floor, danced slightly. The darkness ahead felt palpable, a dense, physical curtain. I felt the cold sweat prickling beneath my clothes, freezing instantly on my skin. "Elias!" Chloe's whisper was so strained it barely registered. "The dripping is gone." She was right. The constant, comforting drip 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 of water from the pipes, the white noise of the underground, had ceased entirely. It was replaced by a total, unnatural vacuum of sound, the kind of quiet you only experience when something massive is absorbing every vibration. Then, the sigh came again. Closer this time. It wasn't the sound of an old building settling. It was a guttural, wet intake of air, like a pump pulling fluid through a clogged filter. And with it came a smell that punched through the carbon filter of my respirator, coppery, sharp, and profoundly organic, mixed with the acrid stench of ozone. Something metallic and chemical, like old blood mixed with industrial detergent. I remembered the smell from the laundry room above, only here it was concentrated, alive. We reached a point in the tunnel where a small, rusted maintenance cart lay overturned, a slight impediment. Chloe, careful not to stumble, signaled toward a narrow, almost vertical ladder recessed into the side wall. It wasn't on my blueprint, likely an unauthorized access shaft. A way out, or just a different way down. I didn't care. Any deviation from the approaching threat was a win. I pointed my light briefly up the shaft. The ladder rungs disappeared quickly into a circular hole perhaps 15 feet up. "Go. Now." "Quietly," I hissed. Chloe scrambled up first, her movements surprisingly fast despite the heavy gear. I kept my light fixed on the corner ahead. Just as her boots disappeared above, I saw it. It wasn't a body part. It was a disturbance. The clay floor around the bend was dark, saturated, and what appeared was a deep, wet depression. Not a footprint, but the impression of something heavy being dragged around the curve, digging a fresh furrow in the wet earth. It looked less like an animal track and more like the scoring left by a submerged tow truck cable, except it was uneven, staggered, and definitely moving. I started climbing the ladder, my pipe wrench held between my teeth. I ascended quickly, the cold, rusted rungs screaming in protest despite my efforts at silence. As I reached the top, Chloe grabbed my arm and pulled me through the opening. We landed in a cramped, dark room. I whirled around, lights searching for the exit hatch. There wasn't one. We were in a tiny, bare concrete cell, maybe 6 feet square, with only a heavy, steel-plated door set into one wall. "This must be a sub-basement storage vault," I panted, yanking the pipe wrench free. I tried the door handle. "Locked, of course." "Elias, look!" Chloe's voice was hushed, her light fixed downward. The room wasn't storage. It was an access point. Directly beneath the grated floor, the space opened up into a cavernous area. We were standing on a small mezzanine above a vast, circular chamber that seemed to extend impossibly deep into the bedrock. This was no utility tunnel. This was the legendary, deep sub-basement, the foundation level. The chamber below was breathtaking and horrifying. It was massive, perhaps 50 feet in diameter, with a vaulted ceiling supported by thick, segmented concrete pillars. But it wasn't empty. It was dominated by a colossal, rusted piece of machinery, a multi-story, cylindrical object that looked like a cross between a defunct cyclotron and an iron lung. Thick, tangled cables snaked out of it, disappearing into the dark, watery floor. The entire area hummed with a low, barely perceptible vibration. This structure was what the old blueprints faintly referenced as the Deep Research Nexus. It looked like it hadn't been active in half a century, yet the air here felt charged, almost electrical. "We shouldn't be here," I muttered, the words tasting like ash. The atmosphere of fear I felt below was nothing compared to the oppressive, suffocating weight of wrongness in this room. Chloe, despite her mounting terror, was a photographer first. She raised her camera and started taking rapid, silent flashes. The brief bursts of light illuminated the walls, revealing what looked like laboratory setup, long since stripped, rusted countertops, shattered glass containers, and complex ventilation ducts designed to move something toxic out of the room. But as the flash went off, I noticed something else on the nearest support pillar, 6 feet away from the mezzanine railing: etchings. They weren't graffiti. They were meticulously carved symbols, repeating patterns of circles and broken lines that looked vaguely familiar, like a perverse combination of ancient runes and circuit diagrams. They weren't just decorative. They looked like they were part of the machine, carved by someone desperate or insane to contain whatever the machine was doing. Then, from the darkness below the mezzanine, near the rusted cylinder, a sound erupted that stopped my heart cold. It was the noise from my nightmares, the one that started this whole trip. The sound that was wrong. It began as a low, mechanical groan, like the ancient, rusted machine below was stirring to life. This was immediately followed by that low, grating scrape, louder now, amplified by the cavernous space. It sounded like the thing from the tunnel had entered the main chamber and was dragging itself across the stone floor toward the Nexus machinery. And then, the scream. It was a sound that didn't obey the laws of physics. It started at a baseline below human hearing, a deep, resonating thrum that vibrated in my chest cavity, making my teeth ache. Then it climbed, rapidly, through the range of human misery, sounding like 1,000 voices being simultaneously torn from a single throat, before topping out at a frequency so high and piercing it felt like an ice pick driving into my skull. It wasn't a vocal cord sound. It was synthesized, or perhaps the byproduct of that massive machine below vibrating, but it carried the absolute, unmistakable emotion of pure, boundless agony. It was the sound of something alive, powerful, and in unimaginable pain. Chloe dropped her camera. It hit the metal grate with a deafening clank. We froze, the scream still echoing, decaying slowly into that horrible, wet gasp, the raw, wet gasp I'd heard in my recurring nightmare. The dragging noise stopped directly beneath us. The only sound now was the loud, rattling inhale of my own breathing and the frantic, shallow gasps of Chloe next to me. My light was shaking so violently I could barely keep it focused, but I forced the beam downward, between the metal rungs of the grate we stood on. I saw it. It was obscured by the shadows and the massive machinery, but enough was visible to confirm my worst fears. It wasn't a zombie nurse, or a ghost, or a rat. It was a shape of impossible geometry. It was huge. Its bulk filled the shadows beneath the mezzanine. It moved on 4 limbs, but they weren't legs. They were thick, misshapen appendages that scraped and dragged across the floor. The skin, where I could see it, was slick and pale, stretched tightly over massive, knotty musculature that pulsed faintly under the harsh light. The ozone smell intensified. But the most immediate, terrifying detail was its head. It was low-slung, disproportionately large, and when it tilted up, sensing us, I saw the twin reflections of my flashlight beam in what must have been its eyes, not black or red, but a dull, sickly yellow, like spoiled tallow. And on its back, stretching from its massive, hunched shoulders, was the reason for the scraping noise, a heavy, corroded metal harness. The harness was fused to the flesh, integrated into the creature's spine and ribs with thick, grotesque bolts, and from it trailed heavy, rusted chains. The dragging sound was not the creature's limbs. It was the chain dragging along the floor as it moved. This thing wasn't natural. It was engineered, shackled, and imprisoned by the very people who built this place. It was a patient, or an experiment, twisted into a grotesque, agonizing parody of life. It was looking up. It knew we were there. A small, high-pitched noise escaped Chloe's throat. She reached down, blindly trying to retrieve her fallen camera, her only link to sanity. The creature reacted instantly to the sound. With a speed that belied its size, it lurched forward. I heard the terrible shing of the heavy chain snapping taut, followed by a sound like a wet sledgehammer hitting thick leather, the creature's shoulder slamming violently into the metal pillars supporting our mezzanine. The whole structure shuddered. Dust and concrete particles rained down on us. The etched symbols on the pillar, catching the light, seemed to vibrate. The sheer, kinetic force of the impact was staggering. This thing was incredibly strong. "Run! The door!" I screamed, finally breaking free of the paralysis. The door was locked. My frantic fingers fumbled with the handle, still locked. There was no key, no keypad. We were trapped on a narrow catwalk above a creature that wanted us. I looked frantically for an alternate escape. My light swept the small room, landing on a small, rusted circuit breaker panel set into the wall opposite the door. It was old, industrial, and looked completely dead. But desperate logic took hold. "Chloe, cover your ears!" I yelled, pulling the pipe wrench back. I slammed the wrench into the fragile, rusted panel cover. It buckled and tore away with a metallic shriek. Inside, a nest of ancient wires and thick, dust-caked switches. The only thought in my mind was that this panel might be linked to the massive machine below, or, more importantly, to the electromagnetic lock on the steel door. The creature below slammed into the pillar again. This time, a deep, structural crack split the concrete above the column with a chilling thwack. We didn't have seconds, we had milliseconds. I aimed my light at the wires, picked the thickest, blackest one, a main power conduit, I hoped, and ignoring every safety lesson I'd ever learned, plunged the end of the pipe wrench deep into the panel. A massive blue-white flash erupted, blinding me momentarily. The sound was a sharp, explosive crack. The ozone smell became overwhelming. The power surge was instantaneous. The huge, rusted machine below us, the Nexus, suddenly roared to life. Rusted gears ground and shrieked, and a deep red emergency light flickered on above it, bathing the entire chamber in a pulsing, malevolent glow. The creature beneath the grate let out a terrible, truncated shriek, not the synthesized scream of agony, but a raw, animalistic cry of pain, and its massive form slumped heavily. The electrical charge had hit it. And in that brief moment of distraction, I heard the definitive clack of the steel door's lock disengaging. "Go, go, go!" I pushed Chloe toward the door. We burst through, slamming the heavy steel shut behind us. I fumbled for the thick, heavy manual bolt, ramming it home with all my strength. We stood, panting, in a new, narrow concrete corridor, completely lost, but alive. The chamber behind us was silent again, save for the dying clack-clack-clack of the Nexus machinery powering down. The electrical surge was temporary, the monster only stunned. We had just committed the ultimate sin of urbex, engaging with the environment and making ourselves known. We were no longer silent observers. We fled down the corridor, our flashlights bouncing wildly, the map of St. Jude's forgotten in the rush. We had one goal: escape. But a horrible, sinking feeling took root in my gut. I had seen the harness, the chains, the bolts fusing steel to bone. This thing was not trapped by the hospital. It was part of its foundation. And by activating that ancient machinery, by disrupting the decades of silence, I felt, with sickening certainty, that we hadn't just stunned it. We had freed it. We stood, panting, in a new, narrow concrete corridor, completely lost, but alive. The chamber behind us was silent again, save for the dying clack-clack-clack of the Nexus machinery powering down. The electrical surge was temporary, the monster only stunned. We had just committed the ultimate sin of urbex, engaging with the environment and making ourselves known. We were no longer silent observers. We fled down the corridor, our flashlights bouncing wildly, the map of St. Jude's forgotten in the rush. We had one goal: escape. But a horrible, sinking feeling took root in my gut. I had seen the harness, the chains, the bolts fusing steel to bone. This thing was not trapped by the hospital. It was part of its foundation. And by activating that ancient machinery, by disrupting the decades of silence, I felt, with sickening certainty, that we hadn't just stunned it. We had freed it. The air in this new corridor was different. It lacked the cold, subterranean dampness of the clay tunnels. Instead, it was thick with a cloying, chemical scent, formaldehyde mixed with something sickly sweet, like cheap perfume sprayed over rot. This wasn't the natural decay of an abandoned structure. This was the smell of long-dormant, preserved work. "This is sub-level 4. Chloe gasped, catching her breath beside me, her light beam catching a fading, hand-stenciled sign on the concrete wall. "Below the morgue and autopsy suite. No maintenance access here." This was restricted. The corridor was lined with a series of heavy, gasket doors, like a submarine. This confirmed the stories. The true, sinister work of St. Jude's happened miles beneath the public face of the hospital. We moved swiftly, our lights sweeping across the ominous doors. The first few rooms were stripped bare, but the fourth door, marked "Recording and Observation," was slightly ajar, the steel frame bent inward near the latch, as if violently forced open decades ago. Hesitation was a luxury we couldn't afford, but neither was blind haste. We needed information. We needed a route. We need a map, or a schematic. Something to tell us where the upper levels connect. I whispered, pulling my pipe wrench free, its familiar weight a small comfort. We slipped into the observation room. It was tiny, shielded by a thick, cracked pane of one-way glass overlooking what must have been an adjacent containment cell. The cell itself was pitch black, but the observation room held remnants of a hastily abandoned workspace, a bolted-down steel desk, a revolving chair overturned, and most importantly, a heavy, fireproof filing cabinet. Chloe, the pragmatist, went straight for the cabinet. I stood watch by the door, the pipe wrench ready, listening over the pounding of my own heart for the drag scrape of the chain. The thrumming silence of the underground had returned, but now it felt like the quiet before a trap snaps shut. The filing cabinet's lock was simple. I smashed the pipe wrench against the handle once, hard. The old metal gave way with a muffled clang. Inside were brittle, yellowed manila folders. They weren't patient files. They were research logs. Chloe pulled out a ledger, bound in cheap imitation leather, labeled simply, "Protocol Delta 1967. I held the flashlight steady as she began skimming the handwritten entries, her eyes wide with mounting horror. The handwriting, neat and almost elegant, belonged to a Dr. Eris. The logs didn't speak of patients, they spoke of Subject 0. "Listen to this." Chloe's voice trembled as she read an entry dated August 14, 1967. Subject Zero's biomass accretion continues at an exponential rate, exceeding all theoretical maximums. Growth is heavily stabilized by the constant application of the sigma bioelectrical current. Without the current, the neurological pathways fragment, resulting in acute hypersensory feedback, what the technicians term the synthetic scream. The acoustic response seems tied to the magnetic field strength of the nexus. My blood ran cold. The creature wasn't just in pain, the terrifying sound was an engineered side effect. The nexus wasn't a power source. It was a gigantic, subterranean tranquilizer gun, forcing a specific, agonizing frequency onto the subject via the integrated harness. We broke the sedative, I whispered, the realization sinking in like a stone. When I hit the breaker, I cut the sigma current. The scream we heard upstairs wasn't it waking up, it was the sound of the current failing. The one in the chamber, that was it fighting free of the forced sedation. The logs continued, growing more frantic with each entry. September 3, 1967. The subject is too large. Containment integrity is failing. The physical form is rapidly adapting to the environmental constraints. The harness is no longer sufficient, the bolts are shearing. Dr. Jensen insists on maintaining the containment frequency via the nexus. He believes the entity's unique neuroplasticity is the key to controlled somatic adaptation, a new form of gene therapy. I maintain this is theological hubris. We are dealing with a singularity of organic malice. September 20, 1967, the last entry, scrawled furiously. Fire on the West Wing has diverted all resources. Jensen is insane. He is rerouting the main hospital power grid to the nexus, attempting to apply a triple sigma burst to freeze the growth. He thinks he can turn the entity into a living foundation, a power core. But the entity is learning. The screams are becoming directive. It is not responding to the current, it is now generating its own. We must evacuate the sublevels and seal the nexus. If it integrates the power source, we don't just lose control, we lose reality. The paper trembled in Chloe's hand. The fire. The scandal. It wasn't just a hospital burning down. They were trying to seal this thing in its own power plant. I looked toward the heavy steel door. The creature was no longer just an experiment. It was a desperate, tortured engine, twisted by mad science and now, potentially, capable of wielding the very forces meant to contain it. The symbols I saw etched on the concrete pillars, the mix of runes and circuit diagrams, they weren't containment. They were ritual, a last-ditch attempt to bind the entity with something more than steel and electricity. A noise dragged me back from the horrific text. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Not the drag scrape of the chains, but a deeper, structural thump. It came from directly above us. It's not coming through the tunnels. I breathed, realizing the terror of the situation. It's in the sub-basement above us. The morgue level. The logs had mentioned the harness bolts shearing. The creature might have been able to leverage its immense strength to pull the bolts free, or the triple sigma burst Jensen attempted might have destroyed the harness entirely. Without the chains, it would move faster than anything we had encountered. We need to go up, Chloe urged, stuffing the ledger into her pack. Find the old autopsy lift or the main basement stairs. We exited the observation room and ran further down the corridor. The passage eventually dead-ended at a vast, open room, the surgical theater sublevel 4. It was a sunken room, tiled in thick, white ceramic that now looked sickly yellow under our lights, surrounding a raised, rusting operating platform. Tools and surgical trays lay scattered everywhere, frozen in time. The room stank of rust and the ghost of sterilization fluid. In the far corner, near a bank of inactive sterilization ovens, was a set of heavy, concrete stairs. They looked steep and unstable, disappearing upward into the blackness. Our only way out. We started to ascend, taking the stairs two at a time. The air grew colder, and the formaldehyde smell slowly gave way to the dusty, stale atmosphere of the upper levels. We reached a small landing, perhaps 20 steps up, when the thudding started again. This time it was deafening, localized, and directly beneath us in the surgical theater. Crock! A sound like a cannon shot. The creature had found the observation room, and its sheer mass had shattered the concrete ceiling, or perhaps the floor above. Dust and small chunks of masonry rained down. I didn't stop to look. Faster, Chloe! It's uninhibited! We reached the second landing, which opened onto a wider, tiled hallway, the morgue and autopsy level, or so I hoped. This section of the hospital was more conventionally built, meaning more rooms, more hiding spots, but also more potential dead ends. We took 5 desperate steps into the hallway when Chloe suddenly stopped, her feet sliding on the slick, dust-covered tiles. Elias, look! Her voice was a cracked whisper, her flashlight beam fixed on the floor ahead of us. It wasn't blood. It wasn't dust. The entire surface of the tiled hallway, stretching out for 20 yards, was covered in a thick, dark, gelatinous residue. It pulsed faintly under the light. It looked like ancient, congealed oil, but it was moving. Slowly, imperceptibly, the dark substance was crawling, receding slightly from the light, yet clinging to the tiles like a living shadow. And running through the center of this field of black goo was a fresh, deep furrow, tracing a path down the hallway, toward an opening that looked like an elevator shaft. The creature, it left a trail. I mumbled, horrified. The logs described biomass accretion and unique neuroplasticity. This wasn't just mud, it was something the entity secreted. Before we could decide whether to cross the horrifying slick, a new sound echoed from the stairwell we had just vacated, the sound of the entity itself ascending. It was no longer dragging chains. It was the heavy, rhythmic pump thud of massive limbs driving it forward. Pump thud. Pump thud. The speed was terrifying. It was gaining on us, freed from its shackles, propelled by a desperate need for silence, or revenge. The pumping noise accelerated into a frantic rhythm, and then, from the mouth of the stairwell, a raw, bellowing scream erupted. It wasn't the synthesized scream of agony. This was the shriek of rage, a triumphant, horrifying noise that echoed off the damp tiles, making my inner ear vibrate painfully. We were caught between a rising tide of organic horror and a hallway covered in living residue. I made my choice instantly. The elevator shaft! Get ready to jump! I slammed my pipe wrench into the nearest fire extinguisher case, the glass shattering with a noise I barely registered. I grabbed the heavy metal cylinder, its weight a meager weapon, and started running across the tiled floor, deliberately stepping into the dark residue. It was cold, unnervingly sticky, and had a strange, repulsive elasticity. As I passed the end of the furrow, I looked down. The residue here was scraped away, revealing clean, wet tile beneath. And in that clean patch, there was a single, undeniable trace, a yellow, greasy smear, left by whatever substance coated the creature's body. The same sickly yellow as its eyes. I heard Chloe's footfalls splash into the residue behind me, but I didn't look back. The entity was on the landing now. Its enormous, hulking shadow began to fall over the end of the corridor, bathing the hallway in a brief, terrible moment of darkness. We reached the elevator shaft. The doors were bent and fused. No hope. The adjacent room! Containment! I yelled, seeing a heavy steel door labeled Contagion Decontamination. It was our only option. We dove inside, slamming the heavy door. I wrestled with the manual locking wheel, spinning the heavy spokes with frantic, desperate energy. Just as the wheel tightened with a final crunch of metal, the door behind me shuddered violently. Thud! The entity had hit the decontamination door. The heavy steel groaned inward, bowing slightly. We were trapped in a dark, confined room, and the silence had been completely replaced by the sounds of a monstrous force attempting to tear its way through reinforced steel. Chloe turned her light beam away from the door and screamed, a real, pure sound of fear this time. She wasn't looking at the door. She was looking at the room's third wall, the one we hadn't seen yet. It wasn't a wall. It was a ceiling-to-floor sheet of thick, ancient plexiglass. And behind the plexiglass, in another identical containment room, was a second figure. It was human. Or mostly human. It was sitting on a low, padded bench, rocking slowly back and forth. It was skeletal, naked, and completely covered from head to toe in the same dark, black, gelatinous residue that coated the floor of the hallway. Its eyes were open, wide, and staring into the darkness of our room, but they were milky white, blind. And as the entity slammed the main door again, with a sound like a small car hitting a wall, the figure behind the glass stopped rocking, raised its residue-slicked hand, and began to tap rhythmically on the plexiglass. Tap tap, tap 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 tap. It was tapping out a beat, an unmistakable, terrifying, organized rhythm. It was a call, a signal. And the heavy pounding from the door responded to it, changing its tempo instantly. The entity knew we were trapped. And now, something else was awake and guiding it. The heavy steel door groaned inward, bowing slightly. We were trapped in a dark, confined room, and the silence had been completely replaced by the sounds of a monstrous force attempting to tear its way through reinforced steel. Thud. Crack. Scrape. Each blow from the entity was a hammer driving reality away. The manual locking wheel was straining. I could hear the internal gears stripping with sickening metallic protests. We had mere moments before the reinforced steel of the contagion decontamination chamber failed. The figure behind the plexiglass continued its frantic, rhythmic tapping. Tap 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 tap. The sound was precise, manic, and somehow deeply intelligent. It wasn't random, it was communication. And the entity on the other side of our door was answering, adjusting its tempo, focusing its terrifying power on the weakest points of the steel. "He's guiding it!" Chloe shrieked, pressing herself against the opposite wall, her flashlight beam fixed on the blind figure behind the glass. "He knows exactly where we are." "Elias! What is he?" I felt a cold surge of nausea. The man was covered in the black residue, pale and skeletal, but unmistakably human. The ledger logs flashed in my mind. The entity is learning. The screams are becoming directive. The entity, Subject Zero, was not alone in its newfound freedom. It had a messenger, a conductor, a person who had been exposed to the substance and retained some level of corrupted, telepathic function. I pulled my attention away from the tapping man. Panic was useless. I scanned our immediate surroundings, my flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. This small room, it was designed to be a sterile lock, a decontamination chamber. "The room has 2 doors. I yelled over the deafening pounding. "One way in, one way out. The door we came in is the entrance lock. There has to be an exit lock on the other side." The room was divided by the heavy, manual wheel door and a second, identical steel door on the opposite wall labeled Procedure Room Egress. I sprinted toward the egress door, my boots splashing in a shallow puddle of rusty water. I grabbed the wheel. It was slightly smaller and less worn than the entrance lock. I heaved on it, my muscles screaming from the exertion. It was jammed. Decades of rust and decay had seized the mechanism. Kerchunk! The entrance door buckled inward at the top, tearing the steel seal. A thick, gelatinous black substance, the residue, began to ooze through the gap, dripping onto the floor with a viscous plop. The sickening smell of ozone and spoiled flesh instantly filled the chamber, overpowering my respirator. "It's through!" Chloe screamed, stumbling back. I spun the wheel again, ignoring the tearing pain in my arms. "Help me, Chloe!" "Now!" She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the wheel with me, her small hands gripping the spokes, and together we applied every ounce of our desperate strength. The metal groaned, and with a terrible, wrenching screech, the jam broke free. I spun the wheel rapidly, the heavy door hissing slightly as the internal pressure seals released. We wrenched the door open and tumbled through into a larger, darker room, a space that felt like a proper, functioning lab before the fall. We were in a central autopsy bay. The room was huge, with high ceilings and heavy marble tables, but it was lined with large, industrial refrigeration units, the old Moore drawers. The walls here were thick concrete, built to contain both bodies and sound. As we ran, I risked a glance back. Through the open egress door, I saw the entrance door finally yield with a terrifying sound of ripping metal. The entity burst into the decontamination chamber. It was faster, larger, and more terrifying than I could have imagined. Its massive, pale body was slick with the black residue, gleaming under its own faint, sickening yellow luminescence. And the tapping man? He was now screaming, a thin, high-pitched, triumphant sound of sheer malice, pointing his slick arm directly at us. "The morgue drawers!" I yelled, pulling Chloe behind a massive, marble autopsy table. "They might buy us time." We squeezed into the cramped space between the table and a bank of empty drawers. The pump thud of the entity's heavy limbs reverberated through the concrete floor, growing closer. Suddenly, the massive morgue refrigeration units in the corner, which had been silent, began to hum, a low, grinding vibration, followed by a rush of cold air. "What was that?" Chloe whispered, trembling violently. I remembered Dr. Jensen's last log entry. He is rerouting the main hospital power grid to the Nexus, attempting to apply a 𝒕𝒓𝒂𝒓 burst to freeze the growth. The Nexus was gone, but the power grid might still be partially active, reacting to the sudden, chaotic energy discharge I initiated when I hit the circuit breaker. The lights and machinery of Sublevel 4 were sporadically and dangerously trying to kick back to life. Just as the thought crossed my mind, an overhead lamp, a massive, articulated surgical light, flickered on directly above us. It cast a blinding, clinical white light onto the marble table and fatally illuminated our hiding spot. The light was a beacon. The pump thud stopped immediately. The entity was right outside the egress door, and it now knew exactly where we were. I heard the sound of its massive body shifting. Then silence. Not the deep, listening silence of the tunnel, but the predatory silence of a snake coiling. And then came the sound that shattered my remaining sanity. Not a scream of rage, but a low, guttural, mimicking sound. A whisper. It sounded like a distorted recording of a human voice, struggling against the confines of a thick, wet throat. "Found you!" The words vibrated the air, heavy and wet, seeming to come from every direction at once. It was a terrifying realization. The creature was not merely physical. It was capable of speech, or at least a hideous, tortured imitation of it. I raised the fire extinguisher, ready to spray its contents into the entity's eyes, a futile but necessary gesture of defense. Before I could act, the entity struck not at the table, but at the light. Bzzzzzzzt. Crash. The entity slammed one of its gigantic appendages against the wall, striking the surgical light's power conduit. The light exploded in a shower of sparks and shattered glass, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. But the impact of the blow was so immense, it shook the very foundation of the room. And in the darkness, the secondary effect of the power discharge hit us. The massive bank of refrigeration units, the morgue drawers, kicked into a high, desperate whine. The doors of the drawers began to rattle violently. The freezing cycle, dormant for decades, had engaged violently. Then, one by one, the heavy, steel-plated morgue drawers began to slide open. From each drawer, an overwhelming smell of ancient cold and preservatives flooded the room, followed by the faint, dust-muffled sound of shifting fabric. They weren't empty. St. Jude's hadn't just closed, it had preserved. We were suddenly surrounded by 24 dark openings, each one exposing a decaying, silent witness to the hospital's final moments. "Elias, movement!" Chloe hissed, pointing her light. Near the rear wall, where the morgue drawers met the wall, one of the drawers had opened fully, and something was slowly, stiffly, sitting up. It was shrouded in a heavy sheet, but the shape was clearly human. The entity, still outside our line of sight in the darkness, let out a new, low growl. It sounded excited. I realized what was happening. The entity, guided by the tapping man, was using the newly activated machinery not to attack us directly, but to flush us out using the only other active forces in the room, the preserved corpses. I grabbed Chloe's arm, pulling her toward the one spot in the room that offered a sliver of hope, the autopsy lift. It was a massive, industrial elevator designed to move bodies and heavy equipment up to the main floor. The The shaft was right next to the morgue drawers, sealed by a heavy, manual gate. We reached the gate just as the first preserved corpse tumbled out of its drawer onto the floor with a dry, dusty thump. The lift gate was secured by a heavy, rusted padlock. "The pipe wrench, Elias!" Chloe shouted. I slammed the pipe wrench against the padlock once, twice, the sound deafening in the confined space. The third blow shattered the lock. We tore the heavy metal gate open and scrambled onto the lift platform. The lift itself was controlled by a simple, industrial lever on a rusted panel. I heaved the lever up. The lift shuddered, then let out a terrible, protesting screech of rusted cables, but it began to move. Slowly. Agonizingly slowly. As we ascended, the morgue room below us became a chaotic scene of reanimated horror. The massive entity was illuminated briefly by the last dying sparks of the surgical lamp's destroyed conduit. Its huge, slick form was towering over the marble tables, and it was now actively herding the stiff, preserved bodies toward the lift shaft, pushing them like obstacles with its enormous appendages. The blind tapping man's screams from the decontamination room had devolved into a constant, high-pitched chatter, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. He was watching his creature work. The lift passed the top of the morgue room. The horrifying scene receding below us. We were finally ascending into the upper levels of the hospital, the parts one had actually planned to explore. Then we stopped. The lift ground to a terrifying, sudden halt between floors. The cable snapped taut above us with a noise like a rifle shot. "No, no, no," I whispered, staring up into the dark shaft. I looked at the lever. It was still in the up position. Then I looked down. Far below, bathed in the faint, sickly yellow glow emanating from the entity's body, the autopsy lift had created a perfect vertical line of sight, a direct connection to the horror. I saw the entity rear back, its massive, muscled body tensing, the dark residue streaming from its skin. It was looking up, straight at us. And then, I heard the final, bone-chilling sound that sealed our fate. It wasn't the tapping man, or the entity's groan. It was the sudden, sharp, metallic snap of the heavy cable above us, starting to fray under an unnatural stress. The entity hadn't just stopped the lift. It had climbed onto the cable from below. We were suspended in a dark, vertical shaft, with a multi-ton creature ascending directly toward us, and the only sound now was the high-pitched, terrifying squeal of metal grating against metal, the sound of the entity's claws finding purchase on the thick steel cable. We were going to be crushed. We were suspended in a dark, vertical shaft, with a multi-ton creature ascending directly toward us, and the only sound now was the high-pitched, terrifying squeal of metal grating against metal, the sound of the entity's claws finding purchase on the thick steel cable. We were going to be crushed. The platform beneath us shuddered violently. The steel cable, already strained, vibrated with a terrifying speed. Looking down into the abyss of the shaft, I could see the faint, sickly yellow luminescence growing brighter. The entity was moving with terrifying efficiency, hauling its massive bulk upward on the only tether connecting us to the morgue level. "Elias, the cable is going to snap!" Chloe's voice was strained to breaking point. She was staring wide-eyed at the spot just above our heads where the thick steel strands were tearing and twisting. I peered up the shaft. We were suspended between sublevel 4 and the main basement, sublevel 3. The distance to the next level access door felt like a mile. The only thing we could do was create a break in the connection. "The power conduit!" I yelled, pointing to a thick bundle of secondary power lines and communication cables running alongside the main lift cable, sealed in a heavy metal sleeve. "The entity is on the main cable. If we sever the secondary lines, it might cause enough feedback or instability to drop it, or at least slow it down." It was a desperate gamble. The lines could be inert, or they could carry enough juice to fry us both. But staying put guaranteed a crushing, agonizing end. I pulled the pipe wrench free from my belt. The heavy tool, which had been a symbol of utility and defense, was now a makeshift weapon of electrical chaos. I had to climb onto the railing of the lift platform, leaning precariously out over the darkness, to reach the conduit sleeve. "Hold the railing, don't look down!" I shouted at Chloe. I climbed onto the platform railing. The lift shuddered again, violently, as the entity gained another few feet, its distorted, whispering voice echoing up the shaft. Closer, always closer. I wedged myself against the cold, oily concrete wall of the shaft and swung the pipe wrench with a desperate, wild motion, aiming for the metal sleeve protecting the cables. Clang! Crack! The first blow barely dented the hardened metal. The second blow shattered the corroded casing. The cables inside, a colorful, disorganized bundle of copper and plastic, were exposed. I didn't hesitate. I swung the wrench one last time, aiming for the thickest bundle of wires I could see. KZZZZZZZT. A massive, blue-white arc of electricity erupted from the severed cables. The blinding flash filled the shaft, momentarily vaporizing the air. The sound was a searing, high-pitched zap that felt like it fried the eardrums inside my mask. The effect was instantaneous and explosive. Far below us, the entity let out an agonizing, synthesized scream, the pure, ultrasonic agony I'd first heard in the tunnels. It was the sound of the Nexus frequency hitting it, amplified by the wet copper and the entity's own conductive, residue-slicked body. The entity had temporarily short-circuited itself. The creature's mass slumped heavily, and its claws lost their grip on the main lift cable. Hump! The entity dropped, falling back into the darkness of the morgue below. I heard the faint, sickening sound of its landing, a wet, heavy splash, followed by a terrible, structural groan from the chamber floor. The lift platform, relieved of the entity's upward pressure on the cable, lurched violently upward, momentarily engaging its motor again. "We're moving!" Chloe cried out, grabbing the lever and ramming it into the up position. We ascended rapidly now, though the speed was still disconcerting on the damaged machinery. We reached the level above, sub-level 3, and crashed to a stop. I quickly wrenched open the autopsy lift gate. We tumbled out into a sprawling, dimly lit space, the main radiology and treatment basement. This level felt different. It was cleaner, wider, and filled with massive, antique medical equipment, huge, black iron X-ray machines, decommissioned radiation therapy units, and rows of lead-lined lockers. The air here was dry and filled with the sterile, metallic dust of decay. "The main stairs are this way," I gasped, pointing to a faint, dust-covered sign that read, "Emergency Exit L3." This was the way out. We ran past the towering, intimidating X-ray units. Each machine stood like a silent sentinel, draped in heavy, protective sheets of lead. The shadows they cast were dense and disorienting. As we neared the exit, Chloe stumbled, catching herself on a massive, rectangular cabinet. "Wait, Elias, my camera bag," she stammered, pointing to a tear in the canvas. "The ledger, the protocol Delta ledger is gone. It must have fallen out when we were on the lift." My heart sank. The ledger was our only piece of tangible proof, our only explanation for the madness we had witnessed. But going back was suicide. "Forget it. We have the memory, we have the story. That book is bait now," I said firmly, dragging her toward the stairs. We hit the stairwell, a solid, concrete structure, and began the final, desperate ascent to the ground floor, L1. The staircase was wide, designed for rapid evacuation, and felt like a monument of stability compared to the tunnels. We cleared sub-level 2, administration and staff quarters, quickly. It was silent, filled with overturned desks and water-damaged paperwork. We reached the final landing, the door leading directly onto the ground floor. Freedom was inches away. I put my hand on the cold, solid brass of the pushbar. I felt the comforting solidity of the metal, the promise of the outside world. Then I stopped. The heavy steel fire door was rattling. Not from the outside, but from the inside. Tap tap, tap 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 tap. The rhythmic, manic tapping was coming from the other side of the door. The blind messenger had somehow gotten ahead of us. I quickly moved my flashlight beam onto the base of the door. The gap was small, but beneath the door, a faint yellow light pulsed. The sickly luminescence of the entity's residue was visible. "It's here," I whispered, pulling Chloe back down 2 steps. Both of them. They knew where we were going. They must have an alternate route, or they used the main elevator. The entity wasn't just physical. It was coordinated, intelligent, and operating on a map of the hospital we didn't possess. The tapping man, the messenger, was acting as its advanced scout, likely utilizing a forgotten staff route or the main, faster freight elevator. "We can't go through L1, Chloe said, her voice shaking but retaining a thread of her journalistic resolve. "We have to find another exit. There has to be a laundry chute or another shaft." I looked around the landing. There was only one other door, a heavy, wooden door marked "Records Archive closed due to fire damage." The Records Archive. It's too close to the fire damage, but it's the only way, I decided, kicking the old wooden door. The lock easily gave way. We slipped into the archive room. It was chaos. The heat from the decades-old fire had warped the walls and shelves. Paper and microfiche were scattered everywhere, brittle and black. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burnt cellulose. We ran down an aisle lined with burnt, skeletal shelving, our lights cutting through the heavy dust motes. The noise of the tapping at the main door was fading, replaced by the ominous, structural groan of the old hospital. Suddenly, Chloe stopped again. Her flashlight beam was fixed on something hanging from a partially collapsed ceiling beam. It was the ledger. Protocol Delta. It must have been thrown clear when the lift lurched, landing somehow inside the archive through a ventilation shaft or fire damage gap. "We need it, Elias," she pleaded, reaching up. "This proves everything." I hesitated. The fear of delay was immense, but the instinct to capture the truth, the core of my old obsession, warred with survival. Quickly. 1 minute. As Chloe retrieved the ledger, brushing the ash from the cover, I noticed a detail on the wall behind the shelving that I had missed in my haste. It was a metal plaque, half melted by the fire. The plaque detailed the original purpose of this section of the hospital, predating St. Jude's Asylum. It was built in 1918 as an annex for the city's largest military hospital, designed to treat shell shock and experimental trauma surgery. The text spoke of an early, catastrophic failure involving a psychophysical convergence prototype. During World War I, a precursor to the Nexus. It detailed how the military annex had been deliberately buried and sealed with concrete after the failure, becoming the sub-basement upon which the subsequent St. Jude's was built. This hospital wasn't just built on a sinister past, it was built on a containment failure. "Elias!" Chloe's gasp snapped me back. She wasn't looking at the ledger. She was looking at the end of the aisle. The light filtering from the broken windows revealed a dark, hulking shadow moving across the far wall. The entity wasn't at the main door anymore. It was in the archive with us. It hadn't followed us up the stairs. It had come through the walls. I realized the horrifying truth of Dr. Eris's log. The physical form is rapidly adapting to the environmental constraints. The entity wasn't restricted to doors and hallways. Its biomass accretion allowed it to exploit structural weaknesses, perhaps even liquefy its slick, residue-covered body enough to squeeze through the massive cracks in the fire-damaged concrete. It let out a low, challenging snarl. It was hunting us, using the dense shelving like a maze. "Fire escape!" I screamed, spotting a small, narrow window covered by a heavy metal grate at the end of the room. We sprinted toward it. The grate was secured by 4 thick screws. I grabbed my pipe wrench and began twisting the first, rusted screw with frantic force. Behind us, a massive bookcase, heavy with burnt files, exploded outward with a roar. The entity had smashed through the shelves, clearing the aisle. It was less than 30 feet away. I could clearly see the sickly yellow glow reflecting off its pale, pulsing skin. It looked less like flesh and more like a single, massive, constantly morphing organ. The second screw was stuck. I hammered the wrench against it, the metal shrieking in protest. I heard the sound of the entity running. The pump thud of its massive limbs was deafening, amplified by the confined space. "It's here! Look out!" Chloe screamed, throwing her heavy camera bag at the approaching silhouette. The bag hit the entity's shoulder with a sickening thwack, barely slowing it. I finally snapped the third screw. I had to get the last one. As I struggled, I felt a shadow fall over me. The entity was right behind us. Its smell, that ozone, copper, spoiled sweetness, was overwhelming. I felt a tremendous gust of hot, wet air on the back of my neck, immediately followed by the terrifying sound of its voice, no longer whispering, but a loud, roaring mimicry of human desperation. "Don't leave me!" And then, a colossal, residue-slicked hand slammed against the grate, centimeters from my head. The force of the blow buckled the metal inward. I snapped the final screw, tearing my knuckles open on the rusted metal. I grabbed the grate and ripped it free. "Go, Chloe! Go!" She plunged headfirst through the narrow window opening. I followed, squeezing through the tight gap. We tumbled out onto a rusted, rain-slicked metal fire escape platform. Below us, the courtyard. Above, the dark, menacing silhouette of St. Jude's. I looked back. The entity's massive, grotesque head was jammed in the window frame, its pale, yellow eyes fixed on us. It couldn't fit. But it was still trying, its body convulsing as it strained against the constraints of the frame. We started down the rickety fire escape, the rusted metal screaming under our weight. I didn't look down. I didn't look up. I just ran. We reached the bottom landing, leaping the final 10 feet to the ground. We were in the overgrown, rain-soaked courtyard. We sprinted through the tall grass toward the perimeter fence, the barbed wire glinting menacingly. As we ran, a sound echoed from the high window of the archive, now far behind us. It wasn't the entity. It was the frantic, high-pitched chatter of the tapping man. I risked a glance back at the window. The tapping man, slick and skeletal, was now standing on the archive floor, silhouetted in the gap left by the entity. He was waving his arm wildly, frantically, pointing the way we were running, providing the creature with a desperate, directional guide. The entity, realizing it couldn't follow through the window, began to move. I heard the deafening crack of masonry from the side of the hospital wall. It wasn't giving up the chase. It was coming through the wall. The entire side of the hospital, where the archives were, began to crack and bulge outward. We hit the fence. I grabbed the cutters from my bag and started sawing at the heavy chain link, my adrenaline masking the pain in my raw hands. A massive, pale appendage, covered in the black residue, tore through the wall of the hospital 30 feet away, followed by a roar of concrete and dust. We were cutting the last wire. We needed one more second. We were cutting the last wire. We needed one more second. A massive, pale appendage, covered in the black residue, tore through the wall of the hospital 30 feet away, followed by a roar of concrete and dust. The sound was not just loud. It was primal, the tearing of the building's shell. The entity was no longer restricted to the internal maze. It was coming for us in the open air. Crunch! Snap! The final chain link gave way. I shoved the cutters back into my pack and, without looking back, grabbed Chloe's arm. We threw ourselves through the jagged opening in the fence and tumbled down the small, overgrown embankment onto the edge of the access road. We didn't stop to celebrate freedom. We scrambled to our feet and ran across the asphalt, heading towards the tree line where my battered Ford Focus was parked, a glorious, mundane beacon of the real world. The site of the hospital, once a fascinating ruin, was now a portrait of absolute terror. From the massive, fresh hole in the side of the archive wall, the entity began to emerge. It wasn't squeezing, it was flowing, like a thick, organic lava, pushing its way out. The sickly yellow luminescence radiating from its residue-slicked body painted the courtyard grass with an awful, unnatural light. I glanced back one last time as we reached the protection of the tall, dense pine trees. The entity had fully exited the wall. It stood on the grass, a colossal, shambling silhouette against the dark mass of St. Jude's. It was the physical manifestation of containment failure, a nightmare finally allowed into the night. And then I saw the other figure. The blind tapping man, the messenger, had also managed to squeeze out through the archive window. He stood on the fire escape platform, now perched precariously on the railing, waving his arms with feverish delight. His high, thin chatter reached us even at this distance. An unholy cheerleading for the creature's chase. "Run! Run! Run!" The entity's wet, mimicking whisper echoed across the empty asphalt of the parking lot. We burst through the tree line and scrambled into the car. I fumbled for the keys, my hands slick with sweat and residue, forcing them into the ignition. The engine turned over once, then sputtered and died, the mechanical protest of a tired old car that knew the gravity of the situation. "Turn it!" Chloe screamed, gripping the dashboard. "It's coming!" I glanced in the rearview mirror. The entity had reached the edge of the asphalt. It was moving with an astonishing, terrifying speed, a bounding, unnatural gait that covered 50 feet in a second. I tried the ignition again. The engine caught, roaring to life. I slammed the shifter into reverse, peeling backward in a shower of gravel, then spun the car around and floored it onto the dirt access road. We tore down the winding, heavily rutted road. The familiar sensation of speed was comforting, but I knew the chase wasn't over. I looked in the side mirror. The entity was a massive, yellow-tinged blur behind us, closing the distance rapidly. Its grotesque figure bounced and lunged, its limbs, now fully freed from the harness, propelling it like a demented, monstrous insect. "It's catching up!" Chloe shouted, twisting in her seat. She held the Protocol Delta ledger tightly, its battered cover stained with dirt and the hospital's dark residue. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor. The old Focus rattled and complained, but it was giving us everything it had. As we rocketed down the road, I realized the entity wasn't just fast, it was unaffected by fatigue. It was a perpetual motion machine fueled by agonizing electricity and decades of forced growth. Suddenly, the side mirror was filled with a terrifying sight. The entity had closed the gap. Its massive, pale head was framed in the passenger side window. Thwack! A colossal, residue-slicked hand slammed into the driver's side door, bending the metal inward with a shriek. The side window shattered into a million pieces, showering me in safety glass. The entity was trying to stop the car, not just chase it. I swerved violently, forcing the entity to lose its footing. Its hand slid off the door, and its massive body scraped against the side of the car before it fell back momentarily. "Give me the fire extinguisher!" I screamed. Chloe, her face white with terror, fumbled in the back seat and passed me the heavy metal cylinder. I jammed my elbow through the remains of the side window, braced myself against the steering wheel with one hand, and aimed the nozzle. The entity was recovering quickly, already bounding back toward us. Just as it launched itself for another attack, I squeezed the handle. The blast of compressed foam and chemicals hit the creature directly in its immense, pale face. Hiss! The entity let out a roar of pain and confusion. The foam, designed to smother fire, momentarily blinded it and coated the sensitive, raw surface of its body. It stumbled, then spun around in the middle of the road, thrashing violently. This gave us the crucial seconds we needed. I sped the car up, forcing it faster down the road, away from the hospital grounds. We passed the old, rusted sign marking the property line. St. Jude's Asylum private property. We had crossed the boundary. We were free. Or so I thought. After a mile of frantic driving, I dared to slow down. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind us was empty, save for the dust kicked up by our tires. The entity was gone. I pulled the car off the road and slammed the brakes. We sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engine and the sound of our ragged breathing. Chloe broke the silence, clutching the ledger to her chest. "We made it. We actually made it out." I nodded, pulling off my shattered respirator mask. My lungs burned, and the stench of formaldehyde, ozone, and the sickening sweetness of the entity's residue still clung to my clothes and hair. "We need to get to a phone, call the police. Or a news outlet," I said, my voice hoarse. "We have the proof now. The ledger." Chloe opened the ledger, her fingers tracing the faded, frantic handwriting of Dr. Eris. "But what do we tell them, Elias?" That we activated a mutated military experiment that can talk and walk through walls? As we spoke, the air in the car began to change. The metallic, cold scent of the entity's residue, which I had thought was just on my clothes, was growing stronger. I looked down at the passenger seat. Chloe was leaning against the door, and where the Protocol Delta ledger rested on the seat, a small, dark puddle was forming. It was the black, oily residue. It was slowly oozing from the binding of the book, soaking into the fabric of the car seat. The ledger wasn't just a document, it was contaminated. "The book," I whispered, pointing. "The entity's substance. It's on the book. We brought it with us." Chloe looked down, her eyes widening in horror. She instinctively threw the book from her lap onto the floor mat. The residue instantly soaked into the carpet. And then, I noticed something else, something far worse. The black substance on the floor mat wasn't just sitting there. It was spreading. Slowly, but deliberately, the dark liquid began to crawl out from under the book, stretching small, sticky tendrils across the floor. It was not a chemical spill. It was alive. I scrambled to my pack, pulling out a spare headlamp, and aimed the beam at the floor. The residue reacted to the light, receding slightly, but continuing its slow, inexorable spread. It was trying to escape the light, to find a dark crevice to hide in. And as I watched, a tiny, almost microscopic yellow speck began to form in the center of the largest puddle of black goo. It was the same pale, sickening yellow as the entity's eyes. "Elias," Chloe whimpered, looking out the back window. There's something on the road." I looked back. The asphalt, now hundreds of feet behind us, was dark and empty. But then I realized what she meant. The entity hadn't stopped at the property line. It hadn't stopped when it fell. Starting from the point where I had pushed the car onto the main road and stretching all the way back into the woods, the asphalt and dirt were covered with a thin, continuous sheen, a long, glistening, dark trail. It was the black residue marking its route. And the trail didn't stop at the road. It continued, disappearing into the dense forest on the opposite side, moving parallel to the road we were on. The entity had not been deterred by the property line or the distance. It was simply faster than the car through the woods, using its immense, chaotic power to smash through the dense undergrowth, maintaining its direction based on the directions of the tapping man. I looked at the oozing puddle on the floor mat, then back at the trail in the woods. The black residue wasn't just a secretion, it was a form of communication and tracking. And now, we had brought a piece of that residue, and the terrifying knowledge contained within the ledger, out into the world with us. The threat was no longer contained within the concrete of St. Jude's. "We have to burn it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We have to burn the book and the car floor." But before I could move, Chloe pointed a trembling finger at the dashboard. Her camcorder, which she had dropped on the seat and which had recorded our entire descent and escape, was now displaying a horrifying, localized static pattern on its screen. The digital display was clean, but the image it was receiving was distorted by massive, localized interference. Then, from the speakers of the camcorder, a new sound began to emit. It wasn't the entity's whisper. It was the frantic, high-pitched, rhythmic tapping, now perfectly clear, as if the tapping man were sitting in the back seat. Tap tap, tap tap tap, tap tap. The sound was coming from the book, from the residue, from the camcorder. A piece of the entity's communication network had traveled with us. It was a beacon. And in the woods, the rustling of large, heavy masses moving rapidly through the dense trees began to grow louder. The rustling in the woods grew louder, no longer just the sound of a large animal, but the rhythmic, heavy pump thud of the entity's terrible gait. Echoing the frantic tap-tap now broadcasting from the contaminated car interior. We had to move. "Fire!" I gasped, my mind racing through basic survival principles. "We need fire to stop the residue and the book." I slammed the gearshift into drive and sped the Focus back onto the road. We weren't driving away from the entity. We were driving for time. It was moving parallel to us through the dense, dark forest, an unstoppable shadow-keeping pace. "My lighter!" "It's in the console," Chloe yelled, fumbling desperately. I swerved the car onto a narrow, gravel shoulder, stopping right next to a concrete embankment overlooking a shallow, water-filled drainage ditch. This was as good a place as any to commit vehicular arson. I ripped the floor mat out of the car, tearing the contaminated carpet where the black residue was slowly coalescing into a sickly, yellow-tinged puddle. The entity's tapping seemed to intensify, vibrating through the metal of the car frame. Chloe found the lighter, a cheap, plastic disposable, and handed it to me. "The book, Elias! Quick!" I grabbed the Protocol Delta ledger, its pages warped by the residue. It felt cold, damp, and unnaturally heavy. I threw it onto the gravel shoulder, then covered it with the soaked floor mat. I flicked the lighter. A small, anxious flame appeared. Just as I touched the flame to the residue-soaked carpet, the sound from the woods reached a crescendo. A towering crack split the air, the sound of a massive pine tree snapping in half. The entity was breaking through the final line of dense trees. I ignited the mat. The residue didn't just catch fire, it reacted. A violent, chemical whoosh erupted. The black goo instantly vaporized into a thick, oily, gray smoke, carrying the sickening ozone stench with it. The fire, however, was contained, licking rapidly at the ancient paper of the ledger. As the book began to burn, something profound and terrifying happened to the entity's signal. The tapping from the camcorder immediately stopped. The localized static disappeared. The heavy pump thud from the woods faltered, replaced by a massive, confused roar of pure, inarticulate agony. The entity's tracking had been severed. We watched the woods. For a few agonizing seconds there was silence. The fire had bought us a temporary reprieve, cutting off the psychic link the tapping man was maintaining through the residue. "It worked," Chloe whispered, clutching my arm. "We broke the connection." But the victory was short-lived. The silence was instantly replaced by a sound far more complex and chilling, the sound of movement, but not just one. I heard the dry, rattling scuffle of multiple objects moving rapidly through the undergrowth. The entity, deprived of its immediate tracking, wasn't retreating. It was engaging its secondary protocol. I remembered the morgue. The reanimated corpses. "It's sending help," I said, pointing towards the rapidly darkening woods. "It can't see us, but it knows our approximate location. It's using the others." The scuffle turned into a series of brittle, wooden cracks as the preserved bodies, the silent witnesses from the morgue, broke free of the undergrowth. They weren't moving with the unnatural speed of the entity, but with a stiff, determined, stumbling pace. There were 4 of them. Pale, shrouded figures, still encased in their filthy preservation wraps, moving toward the burning beacon of the ledger. They had been scattered across the hospital's upper levels, and the entity was now gathering them, driving them toward us. "We need to go," Chloe urged, pulling me towards the car. I scrambled back into the Focus and slammed the door. I gunned the engine and roared back onto the road, putting as much distance as possible between us and the growing line of shuffling horrors emerging from the trees. We drove for what felt like an hour, pushing the car to its limit. We passed the faint glow of distant towns, but I was terrified to stop. The residue, even the trace amounts on our clothing and the driver's side door, felt like a liability. The thought of walking into a diner or a gas station and inadvertently contaminating a public space with the entity's influence was horrifying. We finally reached a remote, abandoned roadside motel called the Whispering Pines. It was dilapidated, but isolated, the perfect place to clean up, check our gear, and review the camcorder footage. The parking lot was empty, the neon sign flickering with a broken W. I pulled the car around to the back, parking it beneath a massive, old oak tree far from the road. Inside the dingy motel room, we immediately stripped off our clothes, tossing the contaminated outerwear, the shredded respirator, the gloves, the boots, into the bathtub. I poured the last of my water bottle over the pile, trying to wash away the residue, though I knew it was futile. While Chloe took a shaky shower, I set up the camcorder. The small, worn machine held the only definitive proof of what we had experienced. I connected the camcorder to the motel room's ancient TV with a frayed composite cable and hit play. The footage was a chaotic, dizzying record of our descent. The initial awe, the discovery of the nexus, the horrified screams, it was all there. I fast-forwarded through the slow-moving segments, looking for the crucial moment, the entity. When the footage reached the morgue and the ascent on the lift, the image was shaky, but terrifyingly clear. We saw the entity's massive, pale hand slam against the side of the lift shaft. We saw the explosive electrical discharge. Then came the audio segment from the archive room. The camera was pointed at the floor as we scrambled for the fire escape. The speakers suddenly crackled with the entity's terrifying, synthesized whisper. "Don't leave me!" I froze the frame. The audio was clear, but the visual was the key. In the brief, bright flash when the entity's hand slammed the grate, the camera had captured a split-second close-up of the creature's massive appendage. It wasn't just pale muscle and residue. Embedded deep within the pulsing, slick flesh, almost like a foreign, protective growth, were shards of metal and twisted wiring. The entity wasn't just a biological experiment. It had integrated the machinery of the hospital into its body over the decades. The metal harness hadn't contained it, it had become part of it, allowing it to interface directly with the hospital's power grid and infrastructure. It was a biomechanical horror, a fused experiment of flesh and steel. Then I realized something about the screams. The original screams, the ones I'd heard through the Nexus machine, were the entity's attempts at human speech, warped by its massive, tortured vocal cords. It wasn't screaming in pain, it was screaming words, the words it had heard in its cell. It was trying to talk to Dr. Eris. I watched the final moments of the footage, our escape through the window, the image flipping violently as we fell onto the fire escape. And then, just before the tape cut to static, the camera captured the blind tapping man, framed perfectly in the archive window. His face, skeletal and slick with the black residue, was twisted in a look of ecstatic, horrifying concentration. He wasn't just waving his arms, his hands were moving with a complex, rhythmic pattern, a form of visual Morse code, directing the entity. "He's the brain," I muttered, shaking my head. "The entity is the body, the power. He's the intelligence, the navigator." I heard the bathroom door open. Chloe stepped out, wrapped in a thin, pale towel. She looked exhausted, but cleansed. "Did you find anything on the tape?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Everything," I said, pointing to the screen. "We have the visual proof, the audio, and the connection. The creature is not just physical, it's mechanical and worse, it's being guided. They are a team." I rewound the tape, intending to show her the final, terrifying frame of the tapping man. But when I hit play, the screen remained black. "The tape, it's blank," Chloe said, confused. "No, it was just playing," I argued, frantically checking the camcorder. The battery was full. The tape was correctly spooled. I hit play again. Black. Rewind. Black. Then, the camcorder whirred and made a high-pitched, metallic tick. And the screen flickered to life, showing a single, clear image. It wasn't a frame from the hospital. It was a still image of the outside of the motel room, taken from the parking lot. The angle was low, slightly warped, as if taken through a fisheye lens. In the center of the frame was the massive, old oak tree, casting a deep, dense shadow. And standing just at the edge of that shadow, partially obscured by the flickering neon of the Whispering Pines sign, was the skeletal, residue-covered figure of the tapping man. He was looking directly into the lens, his pale, sightless eyes fixed on us through the camera. His slick arm was raised, his hand held in that familiar, rhythmic position. Tap tap, tap tap tap, tap tap. The sound of the tapping, silent in the room, was now screaming from the camcorder's speakers, a clear, unmistakable broadcast of our location. They had found us. The residue on our clothes, the faint trace on the car, the sheer focus of the tapping man, it was enough. "We have to go! Now!" I screamed, grabbing Chloe's hand. We burst out of the motel room, running toward the car, barefoot and clad only in light clothes. As we reached the parking lot, the massive, dark form of the entity stepped out from behind the oak tree. It wasn't fast, it was patient. It had allowed the tapping man to locate us and establish the trap. The entity let out a low, guttural chuckle, a sound far more unsettling than its screams, and began its slow, deliberate advance toward the car. The entity let out a low, guttural chuckle, a sound far more unsettling than its screams, and began its slow, deliberate advance toward the car. It wasn't a roar of rage, but a sound of dreadful amusement, a hunter savoring the moment before the kill. The tapping man, perched on the flickering neon sign of the motel, continued his frantic, rhythmic broadcast, directing the beast. The sound from the camcorder, still broadcasting the tapping, was a high-pitched, insistent drill in our ears. We were barefoot, barely clothed, and trapped between the car and the looming, massive shape emerging from the shadows of the old oak. "The camcorder! We have to destroy it!" I yelled, knowing the noise was the lock-on signal. I lunged back into the room, sweeping the camcorder from the ancient TV and smashing it against the concrete wall. The plastic casing shattered, the magnetic tape spilled out in dark ribbons, and the speakers died. The silence was instant, absolute, and terrifying. The entity, which had been moving with methodical purpose, stopped dead. It raised its enormous, pale head, its synthesized voice echoing in the sudden void. "Lost. Signal." The tapping man, still on the neon sign, began to flail his arms wildly, his silent panic more unsettling than the tapping had been. The connection was severed. "Run! Get to the car!" I screamed, grabbing the keys and my small backpack containing a few personal items and the pipe wrench. We scrambled back into the focus. The passenger side door was still bent, and the window was shattered from the entity's previous assault, but the engine was still running. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the door shut, ignoring the jagged glass remaining in the frame. I slammed the car into reverse. The tires spun uselessly on the damp gravel. The entity, recovering its bearings, now seemed to realize we were trying to escape. It let out a frustrated roar and sprinted toward us, covering the 20 feet in a single, colossal bound. Crunch! It slammed its shoulder into the driver's side of the car, instantly collapsing the door inward and pinning my leg to the console. The windshield spiderwebbed, and the entire car rocked violently off the ground. I screamed, not from fear, but from the sudden, blinding pain in my lower leg. The entity ripped its body away from the car, leaving behind a slick, metallic sheen of residue on the crumpled metal. It peered into the shattered driver's side window, its pale, pulsating face inches from mine. The stench of ozone and copper was suffocating. "Can't leave me, Elias." The whisper was chillingly personal, chillingly clear. It had remembered my name from the tapes, from Dr. Eris's logs. Chloe, trapped on the passenger side, reached into my backpack and frantically grabbed the pipe wrench. "Get away from him!" she screamed, swinging the heavy metal wrench with desperate force. Clang! The wrench struck the entity squarely on the side of its face. The metal didn't penetrate the thick, rubbery skin, but the impact, coupled with the integrated metal fragments in its flesh, caused a bright, internal spark of electricity to flare up under its skin. The entity recoiled with a shuddering jolt, releasing the car. It let out a high-pitched, synthesized shriek of localized pain and electrical feedback. The moment it released the car, I slammed the focus into drive. My pinned leg roared in protest, but I pushed through the pain. The car, damaged but alive, lurched forward, crashing through a rotten wooden fence at the back of the motel lot and plunging down a short embankment into the muddy, waterlogged ground of the drainage ditch. The impact jarred us violently. The car was immediately stuck, tires spinning uselessly in the thick mud and water. "My leg is broken," I gritted out, trying to move it. It was useless. "Go! Run! The ditch leads back to the main road." Chloe looked at me, her eyes filled with desperation. "I'm not leaving you. You have to. Get to the highway. Tell someone. You have the memory, the story." I shoved the small, internal SD card from the shattered camcorder into her hand. It contained the raw, uncorrupted video file we had just watched. "Go!" She hesitated for a split second, then scrambled out of the car through the broken passenger window. I watched as she sprinted through the mud and began climbing the far bank toward the main road, disappearing into the darkness. I turned my attention back to the motel lot. The entity had righted itself and was now slowly descending the embankment toward the ditch. It wasn't rushing. It knew I was trapped. But the tapping man was rushing. The skeletal figure had leaped down from the sign and was scurrying along the edge of the ditch, moving with incredible, brittle speed. He reached the crumpled Focus first, peering in through the broken driver's window. His pale, blind eyes seemed to be searching for something, then fixed on me. He let out a dry, rattling hiss, a sound of pure triumph. He leaned into the window, and I recoiled. His slick, residue-covered hand reached out, not to kill me, but to touch the remnants of the car radio. Tap tap, tap 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 tap. The rhythmic sound started again, not from the camcorder, but from the car speakers. The tapping man was now interfacing directly with the car's electrical system, using the entity's residue on his body to establish a new broadcast channel. The car's antenna, still functional, was now an electrical beacon. And then, a second sound joined the tapping. A new, localized voice, barely above a whisper, spoke from the radio speaker, a sound like gravel turning to gas. "We are here now." I stared at the tapping man. He wasn't just directing the entity. He was using the electrical network of the motel, the car, and presumably, the outside world. He was setting up a network of fear. The entity reached the car, its massive shadow engulfing the Focus. It stopped right beside the driver's side, its colossal head looming over me. It was silent now, its pale eyes fixed on mine. I could see the metallic shards glinting beneath its skin, the twisted wiring that was once its containment harness. It smelled less of a creature and more of a battery overload. It reached out a hand, slowly, deliberately, and placed its palm on the roof of the car right above my head. Then, it didn't attack. It didn't crush the roof. It pushed. With a soft, sickening squeal of metal and mud, the entity began to push the small car, with me trapped inside, further down the drainage ditch, into the thick, dark undergrowth where the ditch ended in a large, subterranean culvert. "No! Stop it!" I yelled, fighting uselessly against the pinned console. The entity didn't react to my words. It just applied pressure. The car slid deeper into the mud, toward the dark, gaping concrete maw of the culvert. It wasn't killing me. It was recontainment. It was taking me back, not to St. Jude's, but to a new, local prison. I watched as the entity's silhouette blocked the last sliver of moonlight. I heard the tapping man's victory chatter from the radio. Just as the car's headlights dipped beneath the level of the surrounding earth, I saw the entity pause its pushing. It turned its massive head toward the main highway, where Chloe had run. It let out a final, agonizing whisper, a sound that seemed to travel not through the air, but through the ground itself. "Protocol. Delta. Always. Continues." The pushing resumed, and the world dissolved into the black, sucking mud and the deep shadow of the culvert. I felt the water rising around my feet, the metallic taste of gasoline and fear filling my mouth. The tapping from the radio was the last sound I heard before the mud covered the broken window. I don't know where I am. I don't know if he's dead or if he's back in the dark. I ran. I made it to the highway and flagged down a truck driver who thought I was a psychotic homeless woman. They took me to the next town. I contacted the police, the fire department, the local press. I told them everything. The abandoned hospital, the tunnels, the logs, the creature, the burning book, the laughing. They checked the Whispering Pines motel. They found the crumpled Ford Focus wedged halfway into a drainage culvert, completely submerged in mud. No body. No sign of Elias. Just the car. They found something else. On the driver's side door, where the entity's hand had rested, the paint was gone. And on the bare metal, scratched deeply into the surface, were 5 lines of crude, frantic marks. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a threat. It was a message. The markings were the exact visual pattern of the tapping man's code. The police didn't get it. They called it vandalism. But I recognized it. I saw it on the camcorder footage. It wasn't just a simple tap tap tap. When translated, the message scratched onto the car door read, "We are not alone. The seeds are spreading. The network is awake." I still have the SD card. The full video is intact. I have the proof of the entity, the tapping man, and the horror of St. Jude's. But who do I tell? Who would believe that the tunnels were just a holding cell, and that the real threat is now outside, spreading across every power line, every network, every whisper of static? I'm going to disappear for a while. Find a new place, somewhere quiet, off-grid. I'll keep the card safe. Maybe one day, when I can gather my courage, I'll upload it. I'll call it the Protocol Delta Archive. But every night, when I lie in the dark, I hear it. Not the screams, not the roars. I hear the quiet, incessant tapping. It's coming from the walls, from the phone lines, from the refrigerator hum. Tap tap, tap tap tap, tap tap. It's waiting for me to turn on the light. It's waiting for me to broadcast the truth. And I know, with chilling certainty, that the horror didn't end in the tunnels of St. Jude's. It only just began.